Hi everyone, and welcome to the second of two online dialogues entitled Ellesiya 50 years later that have been organized by the Museo Egizio for the anniversary of the transportation to Turin and installation in the museum of the rock-cut Nubian temple of Ellesiya, a display that opened to the public in 1970. I'm Paolo del Vesco.
And I'm Johannes Auenmüller. And our today's topic or focus will be that we will talk about the relations between Egypt and Nubia, the mutual historical and social relationships. We will give a brief overview about this, so we will not go into any exhaustive discussion, but we will give you a general overview about these relationships. Then we will also focus on the larger region of Aniba, where the chapel of Elicia was originally located. And later we will also focus on the chapel itself and then look beyond Elicia for another monument that is comparable to this speos. And I think we can...
Okay, so let's start from the beginning, from the basics. So how do you think Nubia can be defined?
This is a very interesting question. Nubia has traditionally been understood as a corridor to Africa, so as a way or region connecting Egypt and Africa. But Nubia is not only a transitional zone that connects these two regions, but is also a cultural landscape in its own right, with an amazingly rich history from the Paleolithic, so the Old Stone Age, until today. For the Egyptologists, in larger terms, Nubia is Egypt's southern neighbor, so pharaonic Egypt's southern neighbor. And it stretches also in archaeological terms from the 6th cataract north of Khartoum to the 1st cataract at Aswan. So geographically, Nubia is the large region covering much of the so-called Middle Nile Basin. Nubia is thus the valley of the River Nile. Nubia is characterized by several cataracts that create unique landscapes and that subdivide Nubia into individual subregions, including also the desert regions. More recently, the term Nubia has a more restricted meaning and is limited to the riverine areas of northern Sudan and southern Egypt, where even today, or not even, but where today Nubian languages are still spoken. So you see the slide on the right, you see that in the north, south of Aswan, Kenzi Nubian is spoken. Further to the south, Nubian, including the Mahas dialect, is spoken, and then in the region of Dongola, the so-called Dongolawi or Anandi Nubian is spoken. The Egyptians themselves, they call the whole region south of Egypt Tasseti, and this term also included the area around Aswan, so the 1st cataract. And you see those cataracts in the central image as little red lines that subdivide the Nile Valley course into several regions. And the northern part of Nubia, Lower Nubia, between the 2nd and the 1st cataract was called Wawad by the ancient Egyptians, and the southern part, everything more or less south of the 2nd cataract, with a rather fuzzily defined border to the south, was called Kush by the ancient Egyptians. After we've now sort of largely defined what Nubia is, or how we understand Nubia in geographical terms, Paolo, can you tell me something about how Nubia was sort of discovered, or how the Western world, we have to say, the scholarly world, came into contact with this region?
Yeah, sure. Well, before developing into a proper discipline, let's say, Nubian or Sudanese archaeology started as a general interest of 18th and 19th century Western travelers and scholars. And yet this interest was mainly focused on ancient Egyptian monuments in Nubia. So most of them, of these scholars and travelers, including the French Tuscan expedition of 1828, 1829, that was led by Champollion and Rosellini, stopped at Abu Simbel and Wadi Alpha, so at the second cataract. And as you can see in the slide, the image at the top right is a photograph by Antonio Beato of the Calabsha temple, how it was, of course, before the houses of the local people that were living around the temple were removed, and before the temple itself was dismantled and moved to another place, a different place. Only a few travelers, including James Bruce, Alessandro Ricci, Linan de Belfond, Caillot, and later Lepsius and Gardner Wilkinson, went much farther south. And you can see two images here on the left, a watercolor of the inside of a temple of Jebel Barkal, made by Linan de Belfond, and the copy of the inscriptions, the hieroglyphic inscriptions, again from Jebel Barkal, made by Richard Lepsius during his expedition. Then the last image of this slide, which is a longitudinal section of the Nile Basin south of the Aswan Dam, it shows that the height of the dam was changed in time, and every time that the dam was heightened, then also new archaeological research was needed in order to rescue and to salvage documentation that was otherwise would have been gone lost underwater. And so this image shows that the development of Nubian archaeology was intertwined with political and economic interests, as it always or often also the case with archaeology in general. And so, for instance, we see that with the Mahdist War, the explorations stopped, and after the British occupation of Egypt, the 1898 Anglo-Egyptian occupation of Sudan, cities, let's say, were reopened in Nubia for foreign expeditions. And so, for instance, at the beginning of the 20th centuries, Steindorf, Burckhardt, and Schäfer worked on the Egyptian Middle Kingdom fortresses. And then, with the new heightening of the Aswan Dam in 1907, the first archaeological survey of Nubia was launched and was sponsored by the Egyptian government. And in this case, it was directed by George Reisner and Cecil Firth. Then at the end of the survey, Reisner started excavating for the Harvard-Boston expedition in some of the most important Nubian sites, like Kerma, Jebel Barkal, and Meroe. And between 1929 and 1934, the second archaeological survey of Nubia was launched due to the further heightening of the Aswan Dam again. So we see this connection with the economic interests of the country and the archaeological development, the development of archaeology in Nubia. In 1936, Fairman and Blackman, working for the Egypt Exploration Society, excavated at Sesebe and Amara West. And after World War II, research was resumed, but in 1956, with the Suez crisis, of course, it was again stopped. So it wasn't until 1959 that the planned construction of a new huge dam south of Aswan led to the Egyptian government and UNESCO appeal for the rescue of the Nubian heritage to which more than 40 international expeditions responded, and which was very well described by Beppe Moiso in the previous dialogue of this series. Today, archaeology and research in the Sudan is conducted by or in collaboration with the Sudanese authorities, of course. The NCAM, for instance, the National Cooperation for Antiquities and Museums. And the archaeology that is done today applies the highest standards of archaeological excavation and documentation. If we can see the next slide, please. The archaeology today is not only and not just excavation and documentation, but it's important that archaeology is more than this. It should, in fact, take into account different perspectives and be concerned with the well-being of the local communities, for instance, living in and around the archaeological sites. Here in the two photos on the right, you see the involvement of the local inhabitants of the site of Amara West. And during a wonderful community archaeology project that was made by the British Museum mission at Amara West, and especially by Tomomi Fushiya. So it is important today to include in every archaeological project also this aspect of involvement of the local communities. So now going back to the history of ancient Nubia, shall we give a brief outline of the development of Nubian culture?
Yes, I think this would be a very good idea. And the starting point to briefly discuss or highlight these Nubian-Egyptian relationships, or as a good starting point, we can choose this so-called A group. That is an archaeological culture in Lower Nubia itself that was defined by George Andrew Reisner in 1907. And you've just heard this name Reisner mentioned by Paolo in the regards of that he excavated several key sites of the archaeology of Nubia. And the A group is a Neolithic society characterized by semi-nomadic lifestyle, the production of food, by agriculture, and herding of domesticated animals. It lasted from around 3,800 to 3,100 before Christ, BC, and is thus contemporaneous to the proto-dynastic period in Egypt. So just before in Egypt the first kings emerged. The A group is mainly known from cemeteries all along the lower Nubian Nile Valley. So when you see it in this map on the left, you see the column Egypt that is blue, and you see the two archaeological cultures, Nagara 2 and 3, and to the right you have the A group, you know, that you find in the central column, and right on top of this image you have the river Nile, you know, in this case not flowing direction to the north, but in alignment with the slide. So, and now we are focusing on this A group shortly. And yeah, as I said, the A group, this archaeological culture, is mainly known from cemeteries that stretch all along the lower Nubian Nile Valley. And this group can be defined or is characterized by a particular pottery that is very fine and that we are used to call eggshell ware, because the dimension of the walls is as fine as the shell of eggs. And it also has a very particular decorative style that you can see in the slide. And talking about the relationships between Nubia and Egypt, then the A group is a key archaeological time, because the A group, they had intensive trade contact with Egypt. And these trade contacts that were not only in economical terms, but also then in social and cultural terms, is then also evidenced by many Egyptian objects that are found in the burials. And you see to the lower right a drawing of a burial of the A group from Ashkade, where I highlighted the presence of Egyptian wine jars. This is just one element. All or most of the other grave goods, they belong to the Nubian tradition and also the way how the body is positioned. But with these kind of finds where we really know that these types of vessels were made in Egypt and were shipped to this region, then we can understand and see and trace, this type of contact. Interestingly, also the tombs and the material culture, all the finds and things and objects those people lived with and equipped their dead with, they also show strong social and also regional differentiation. So there are many regional power centers all along the Nile, and there is one particular place that is called Kush, where we can trace a very specific form of a local elite concentration at this place, because from there we know an extensive elite cemetery with really monumental tombs dug in the ground with rich funerary goods, including also many, many Egyptian jars. And also one of those incense burners was found in the context of one of these tombs. And interestingly, this incense burner as an object belongs to a local Nubian tradition, but its imagery resembles earlier or contemporaneous Egyptian imagery of power, of early kingship. So we see a parade of boats towards a ruler, that is dressed like an early Egyptian pharaoh, or in the way that we know it from the Egyptian sources. So what we see here, that the object that bears these images is only symbolically meaningful in Nubia, but the iconography is something that we as Egyptologists are used to see in Egypt. And here we seem to find a local, let's say, proto-kingdom along in Lower Nubia. So we see leaders within the A group that have monumental tombs and also use objects and iconography that sets them apart from the normal semi-nomad in their neighborhood. Yes. Well, and after the Neolithic A group, then we can now go sort of back to Egypt and look now on the perspective that Egypt had on Nubia in the Old Kingdom. Paolo, can you say something about this?
Yeah, as you said, there's this kind of intermingling of the two cultures, and this goes on and continues also in the subsequent periods. And also what we see is that the relations between ancient Nubia and ancient Egypt almost alternate continuously between military expeditions and commercial exchanges. So we know that the A group suddenly, or apparently suddenly, disappears at the same time of the late First Dynasty, and at least it disappears from the archaeological record, of course. And so we might think that already at the very beginning of the Old Kingdom, so with the First Dynasty, the Egyptians were already expanding or military controlling this, at least this part of Nubia, Lower Nubia. What we know for sure is that by the Fourth Dynasty, a fortified town was built at Bukhan, which is near the Second Cataract. And probably this town became the main trading outpost of the region. For the Egyptians, was the main place where to get materials like gold, copper. And we also know that King Snefru, and we know it from an inscription from on the Palermo stone, made a military expedition in Nubia, and probably in the Nubia that was south of the Second Cataract already. And he boasts to have captured something like 7,000 prisoners and 200,000 cattle. So if maybe these figures are not real, so are just part of propaganda, it is true that Egyptians were in constant need of people and animals, because they were at that time developing a lot their agriculture in Egypt, and so they needed also a lot of people. And a more commercial character, for sure, have the expeditions that we know of from the biographical inscriptions left by the leaders, who were important Egyptian officials of Elephantine, for instance, in Aswan, and the inscriptions that they left on their tombs. We know, for instance, of a Sabni who lives for Nubia with 100 donkeys loaded with honey, oil, textiles, and faience, and it was intention to bring back the body of his dead father that died in a previous expedition in Nubia. Or we know about Erkuf, who led something like 4 different expeditions for the pharaoh, and brought back incense, ebony, leopard skins, ivory tusks, perfumes, and also a pygmy for the great joy of the pharaoh Pepi II. And this wonderful inscription, and also the letter that the pharaoh Pepi II sent to this expedition leader was carved on the facade of his tomb in Kubet al-Awa in Aswan. And you see here a photo, an image of this facade. What is interesting from this text is also that we get a more, or a better image of the different groups and different, actually, countries that were in Nubia. And so the work of the Egyptologists has been to try to identify and to locate precisely, or as precisely as possible, the position of toponyms like Sechu, Irchet, Wawat. We already said before, Johannes said, is associated with Lower Nubia, for sure. But then the more problematic term is Yam, which might have been used for the area of Kerma, which is now at the Third Cataract, or might also have been used for a country that was farther south. So then, after the Old Kingdom, we see a different approach, let's say, to Nubia by the Egyptians, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Then the late Old Kingdom led these temporary expeditions led by people like Harhuf, expedition leaders to Nubia. But during the Middle Kingdom, the policy of Egypt towards Nubia shifted and towards a complete occupation and direct control, so leading to the political annexation of at least Lower Nubia. Many individual military campaigns were launched towards Nubia, and it's no need to list them all today. But under Sesostris I, the region until Buhain was under Egyptian control. And under the king Sesostris III, the whole region up to the second cataract was dominated. And you see this image of Jean-Claude Galvan to the lower right, where you see the fortress of Semna and the fortress of Kuma on the other side, directly at the rim, so to say, of this cataract, controlling the river, controlling the trade, the people that go along the river north and south. And the motivations behind this political annexation and towards the also building of these fortresses, I will come back to them later, was on the one hand based on royal ideology. So it was the king who was meant to extend the borders of Egypt. But then we also have the economic background. So it's also about resource control and extraction. So Paolo already mentioned gold and mentioned all the other materials like ebony, ivory. So there was a need to get them or get control of them. And this need was also to establish and control those trade routes, you know, to lay specific control posts along them so that all river and desert travel could be monitored and could be, yes, understood and administered as well. And then there were also various concerns about potential threats that were posed by different Nubian groups and people that were living there and obviously were sometimes also hostile, obviously, against the Egyptian dominators. And all this idea of the political occupation of Lower Nubia is manifest in a chain of fortresses along the Nile that display an enormous logistical and economic enterprise undertaken by Middle Kingdom Egypt. Some of these fortresses are found next to the river in the northern part. Others sit on high promontories overlooking the river. And each spot involved also the adaptation of an already established and highly sophisticated fortification architecture. So you see a photo of Buhain before it was flooded, and you see all those parapet walls and the ditches in front of the walls. So it's a very sophisticated and elaborate architecture that we see. And if we look at the location of those fortresses, we see that some of them are located in areas where we have a high density of a local C group population. So a later local Nubian semi-nomadic pastoralist / also Neolithic sedentary lifestyle leading population. But then other fortresses also sit at spots which allow access to the long distant trade routes to the Nubian and through the Western Desert, or also to the gold mines. And particularly the fortresses of Semna and Kuma, they also mark the southern boundary of Egypt. So this southern point reached by Sesostris III and occupied as colonial Nubia. Yes, and as I already said, the local Nubian population is the so-called C group in archaeological culture that is also distinguished by its particular pottery and also burials and other features. And you see one C group bowl from our collection here in Turin and on the slide. And this in fact comes from Jebelain, so a site in Egypt. And also with these kind of objects, we also see this entanglement or these how Egyptians and Nubians lived also together in mainland Egypt, at least in southern Egypt. And in fact, those C group people, farmers and semi-nomadic herders, these are those people that our expedition leader Harhouf also traded with. Well, and then the Middle Kingdom fades out into the second intermediate period, and in Lower Nubia, also the C group slowly transitions into something else, while in the South and Upper Nubia, a new local power has already been emerging. And Paolo, can you tell us more about the so-called Kerma kingdom?
Yeah, so what you said about the militarization of Lower Nubia and the concerns of the Egyptians, it's also possible that they were due exactly, precisely to the growing power of the African kingdom of Kerma, a town located south of the Third Cataract, which had access to a large cultivated floodplain as well. Also, it was located at the intersection of important trading routes and extended its control over a vast territory between the Second and the Fourth Cataract. This is what in the Egyptian text was called the Kingdom of Kush. And during the classic period, that is between 1700 and 1500 BC, Kerma was a large settlement, and you can see here a map of the town. A settlement that was surrounded by a defensive wall and included houses, large palaces, storage facilities, chapels, a circular meeting hall, and a cultic complex, which is the imposing mud brick structure that you can see in the top left photo. Known as the Western Defufa, with a Nubian word that is used for high man-made mounds, is about 20 meters high and has at least 12 different building phases that were identified during the excavation of this monument. And then the vast necropolis of Kerma that was located 4 kilometers east of the town. It extended on more than 90 hectares, and it had something between 30,000 and 40,000 tombs, which are typically circular tumuli of various sizes. And the largest of these tumuli reaching the diameter of 90 meters, which is really impressive. So what about the New Kingdom then, Johannes? What happens with the Kerma culture?
What happens with the Kerma culture? At the beginning of the 18th dynasty, the first kings of the Egyptians' 18th dynasty, so Kamose and his successors, they led individual military campaigns against or versus the south, and in the end this led to the complete defeat of Kerma. So there was a sack of Kerma. Kerma was burned down, and but close to Kerma then the Egyptian also installed an Egyptian outpost at this place that we are used to call Dokigel in these today. So at the beginning of the 18th dynasty, the New Kingdom, Egypt now again colonialized Nubia. And not only Lower Nubia, but it went even further south towards the Third Cataract, really to include the whole territory of the Kerma Kingdom. And this sort of reconquest of Nubia, as it's commonly called in Egyptological literature, prompted the reoccupation of older towns in Lower Nubia, so all the Middle Kingdom towns that were already there, and also the foundation of new Egyptian settlements in Upper Nubia. And also here, the motivation for this colonial undertaking or this colonialization of Nubia was the oversight and administration of this region. It was meant to facilitate the extraction of resources, so both agricultural resources, crops, and cattle, and so forth, but also natural resources. Then it was also about the control of the riverine and desert trade routes, and more or less, like in the Middle Kingdom, a generally assurance of the security of Egyptian interests in the region. So the New Kingdom pharaohs then built a sequence of towns, new pharaonic foundations along the Nile. And these towns were equipped with larger stone-built temples, and these temples were in the focus of the earlier archaeologists because they wanted to find pharaonic monuments inscribed with texts, with images showing kings and deities. Thus, these towns have traditionally been called temple towns. But more recent work at Sai or Amara West, you've heard the place name Amara West already, that focuses more on daily life experiences in these houses, in the towns or in the workshops, is now adjusting this temple-centered view and allows to understand those Egyptian foundations in their local and regional context, also including their embeddedness into the local Nubian landscape and population. As you see on the left, one major resource Egypt was interested in was gold, and thus the location of many of these New Kingdom foundations, particularly in Upper Nubia, the location of which is seemingly related to, again, to asserting control over the gold mining and further processing, because many of those newly founded sites concentrate in an area that is rich in gold, and that also the Egyptian textual sources call the gold of Kush. So you see it in the slide where all those points are sitting. And if we now come a little bit more into the Nubian-Egyptian relationships, then we on the one hand see that those new pharaonic foundations were the seats of power of the Egyptian administration. And in the earlier waves of colonialization, so in the early 18th dynasty or the mid-18th dynasty, also those people who were building and inhabiting and like founding these places, they were seemingly posted from Egypt itself. But later, once these places were in existence for a few generations, then we see mixed populations and shared lifestyles. So shared Egyptian and Nubian types of arranging daily affairs, so an entanglement, as we say, of Egyptian Nubian cultures. And this is, for instance, also expressed in the use of Nubian-style cooking pots in several of these towns. And another very striking example of Egyptian-Nubian or Nubian-Egyptian relations, or how those two cultures or those people who either identify as Egyptian or Nubian or maybe as both, is seen at tomb G244 at Amara West. This was a communal tomb with a superstructure of a traditional Nubian tumulus, so a round structure, something that we also know from the Kermia cemetery that Paolo just talked about. And so a very, very traditional Nubian type of tomb superstructure, but the underground chambers of these tombs were in form and layout and design, let's say, typically Egyptian, and also the burials that were found there follow the Egyptian tradition. So with these tombs, we see the display, so to say, of cultural affinities in two ways. Those people that were buried there show their Nubian-ness more or less towards the visitors or all those people who would come to this cemetery, to everything that is above ground. But they want to be buried as Egyptians, or there are Nubians towards the visitors and Egyptians in death, so to say. And speaking of the importance of Nubian identity and Nubian power, we see then that after the New Kingdom, after a while, a new local power emerges even further to the south of the main concentration of the New Kingdom sites, and even further to Kerma. Paolo, can you go into a little bit more detail regarding Napata?
Yeah, sure. We actually have to wait for 3 centuries after the end of the New Kingdom to see, at least in the archaeological record, of course, the rising of a new Nubian kingdom. the kingdom that was centered, based in the Napata region. So we are the upper Dongola Reach, around the fourth cataract. And here we see, though the origins of the Napatan kings are still unclear, we see that by the 8th century BC, the center of this kingdom is the ancient city of Napata, and was flourishing around this massive outcrop, sandstone outcrop that you see in the photo in the upper right of the slide, the outcrop of Jebel Barkal, the sacred mountain. A mountain was already considered as sacred during the New Kingdom, and was actually thought to be the Nubian seat of the Egyptian god Amun. And so that's why during the 18th dynasty, a big Amun temple was built that you see in both the plan and the photo in the upper left. That was taken from the top of the mountain. And the Napata kings, like Alara, Kashta, Piye, Taharka, Tantamani, built their palaces and temples here in Jebel Barkal, at the feet of the mountain on its eastern side mainly, or they added and modified the great temple of Amun that was built in the 18th and modified in the 19th dynasty. The Napatan kings also reversed the typical trend that we have seen so far. And so they invaded Egypt and ruled Egypt as what is known in Egyptological literature as the 25th dynasty, between the mid-7th and the mid-6th century BC. These kings were buried in the two royal cemeteries of El Kurru and Nuri, which are not too far from Jebel Barkal. And they were buried in tombs that were made of underground rock-cut funerary chambers and a superstructure in the shape of a pyramid, as those that you can see in the photo at the bottom right. These are the pyramids of Nuri. So we stop here our outline of the history of Nubian culture, and let's go back now to the Aniba region, and let's look more in detail at this region.
Exactly, that's what we shall do. And the interesting thing is that when you spoke about Jebel Barkal and the Amun temple, you already mentioned the term religious topography. And this is now something that will concern us when we are looking back to Lower Nubia. May I have the next slide? Because now we are going to the region where the Ellesiya temple, so our main actor today, so to say, was located originally. This small map on the left shows the location of Aniba and the Nubian villages during the 1960s, before the whole region was flooded by the waters of the reservoir. And the ancient town Aniba was located on the vast plain next to the Nile, in a, let's say, rich agricultural area. It can be dated, or the earliest traces can be dated to the Egyptian Old Kingdom already. And during the Old and Middle Kingdom, this fortress was substantially enlarged, and the town and its population then also expanded. And during the New Kingdom, Aniba became the seat of the colonial administration of Lower Nubia. So if you remember what I said about New Kingdom, Egypt and Nubia, this was the headquarters of the colonial administration of Lower Nubia. In the town itself, since every Egyptian town needs a temple, the temple was erected to honor Horus of Aniba. Horus of Aniba is the patron god of the entire district of Miam, how the ancient Egyptians called this region. No standing remains of this temple could be found except from some mud brick foundation walls, but several of the inscribed fragments that were found by Georg Steindorf when he excavated the site tell us about the decoration and also tell us to which god this temple was dedicated to. Horus, the Lord of Aniba. The next slide, please. The town of Aniba and the temple of Horus, the Lord of Aniba, is not alone in this region. On the east bank, so more or less opposite of Aniba, we find I think there is one slide missing. Exactly, thank you. We find a high promontory, a high prominent hilltop on which top a later medieval fortress and religious center is located. Old photos before the whole valley of the river was flooded, they show this dominating position of this place called Kasser Ibrahim over the Nile. Nowadays, it only appears from the reservoir as a small island. And looking back at the New Kingdom, several inscribed blocks dating from this time were found there, and they seem to indicate that there were earlier pharaonic buildings there. We are not really sure whether they are temples or other structures. Some shaft tombs at the northern end of this site also hint at the fact that this place was populated during the New Kingdom. And interestingly, this stela that was found at Kasser Ibrahim, now in the British Museum, it shows King Amenhotep I, again before the patron deity of this region, Horus of Aniba. So again, this important deity also played a role at this hilltop settlement opposite of the main town of this region. Can I get the next slide, please? And a little bit down the cliff of the Kasser Ibrahim fortress, we find a number of rock-cut shrines, 4 of which can be dated to the New Kingdom. They are very simple rectangular chambers hewn in the rock, and they open to the west and overlook the river. And today, Shrine 1 is of interest to us because it dates to the reign of Thutmose III and was built by the Viceroy of Nubia called Nechi. And the Viceroy is the person, the highest official that is responsible for the administration of Nubia, both Wawat and Kush. If we look inside, we don't really see that many remains of the relief because it's largely destroyed or not really fully preserved. But the traces show that principal Nubian deities like Horus of Aniba, but also Horus of Buhen, so a Horus of this fortress Buhen in the north, and the Horus of Baki, which is Horus deity of a fortress and settlement called Kuban at the mouth of the Wadi Alaki, and the Hathor of Ibshek, which is a local Hathor form from Faras, are shown next to Zatet and Anuket, paying homage to the supreme national god Amun-Ra. And the southern wall, the other wall, shows this viceroy who built this shrine, bringing tribute to Thutmose III. And again, more or less the same items or materials are mentioned here that also Khafuf was interested in the late Old Kingdom, namely gold, ivory, and ebony. And in the niche of this shrine, we see 3 seated statues. We see Thutmose III, the king, in the center, and he's flanked by Horus of Aniba to his right, and Satet of Elephantini, so one of the main cataract deities from the first cataract at Aswan to his left. So what we see a small cult shrine to honor the king and local deities, amongst them prominently again Horus, the lord of Aniba. May I have the next slide, please? And this now brings us also to Ellesiya, because Ellesiya is part of this whole cultic religious landscape that was created under Thutmose III around Aniba. Ellesiya lies about 2 kilometers north of Aniba and Kasser Ibrahim, and it's a very important place within the larger religious topography of the region. Ellesiya, the chapel or hemispios or temple, however you will call this structure, was built by Thutmose III in his regnal years 51-52. And again, this structure is dedicated to Amun and Horus of Aniba. Next slide, please. This is just a short overview of the architecture. It's hewn in the local sandstone rock. It's T-shaped with a transverse hall and a further room leading towards the east. It's not fully rectangular, so the stonemasons fitted this into the geology also of the sandstone. The inner walls are decorated in raised relief, and at the end of the chapel in the niche we again have 3 seated statues. So now let's look a little bit more into detail as regards the decoration. And Alessa Fasson and Beppe Moiso already touched upon this, but I want to highlight also this local context or local nexus that we see here in the decoration. So for every king, the coronation is a prerequisite for being a king, obviously. So at this wall in the local south, the central image is the coronation. Thutmose III sits enthroned and is embraced by Nechbet and Wajid, that are the 2 deities for the crowns and also for Upper and Lower Egypt. And all the flanking scenes, they exemplify the relationship of this king with Lower Nubia, because he is shown again with Horus of Buhen, so the Horus of this fortress in the north, and of Hathor of Ibshek from this place called Faras, and also with Horus of Aniba and Satet on the other side. And when we look to the western wall of the southern side, so the image, the lowest image on the slide, no, please go back. Please go back. Can you please return to the other slide? Va bene, grazie. We see that the king here appears before Horus of Hierakonpolis, Dedwin, and Sesostris III. And here we see that this sequence also has cult geographical and administrative implications. Hierakonpolis was traditionally the northern border of Nubia. Sesostris III, he is the Middle Kingdom hero in subjugating and conquering Nubia. He was venerated at Semna, which was the southern border of Egypt and the Middle Kingdom. So they are sort of north and south, and in the center we see the other god Dedwin. He is representing the resource-rich region in between. Next slide, please. The other half of the temple, the northern one, is more connected with deities and the cult that takes actually also part or takes place in the north, in Egypt itself. And here we also see the king in a different role. At first, he is welcomed by Horus of Aniba again, because Horus of Aniba is the main deity of this chapel. Then the king again is shown in adoration of Horus of Kuban. So the local connex is still strong. But then the king is led in to Satet by Anuket, so another deity of the First Cataract region. And later then, on the longest wall to the south, the king himself appears before Chnum, the main deity of the first cataract. So here we see also a geographical sequence from south to north, starting with Aniba, going north to Kuban, going to the first cataract, and then in the center we see the king in a ritual, a royal power rejuvenation ritual before Amun-Ra, so the main state deity of the New Kingdom. And we know that his main temple was at Karnak, so at Thebes. So here we see sort of a geographical sequence towards the north. And more Theban deities appear around Amun, such as Min and Mont. Next slide, please. And in the central room towards the niche on both sides that are decorated, also these cult topographical implications continue. So all the main deities of the chapel appear again. We see Horus of Aniba and also Amun-Ra. He is now sort of the counterpart of Horus of Aniba. And both of them are accompanied by further gods that are important for the region, meaning the region of Aniba, Saatet, Horus, the bull of Nubia, and Tot. But the culminating point of the decorative program is the three-figure statue group in the niche. And based on the preserved inscriptions and the iconography, they can be identified as Amun of Karnak. He sits to the left, to the north. In the center, we have the king, Thutmose III, and Saatet, Saatet to the, sorry, I was mixing up. Thutmose III in the center, Amun-Ra in the north, and Horus of Aniba in the south. But here we come to the tricky part in this, and that's why I was confused. This is only a later stage of the decoration. We know from other data that the original layout of this niche and the statues was meant to show the Horus of Aniba in the north, Thutmose III in the center, and Saatet in the south. So sometime, most probably after the Amarna period in the early 19th dynasty, then something was changed and the order of the deities was adjusted to a new understanding of this chapel. But nevertheless, the Ellesiya chapel is a chapel dedicated to Thutmose III as a king, next to Horus of Aniba, and then also including Amun-Ra as the royal or state deity. And Horus of Aniba and Saatet, they have a specific relationship with Nubia, as I told you, and Amun-Ra is the state god of this time. And not only in Ellesiya, but also in other temples that were built by Thutmose III, we see that several local Horus deities are venerated. So the Horus of Baki in Kuban, the Horus of Miyam in and around Aniba, and the Horus of Buhen in Buhen. And these old local Nubian deities, they were integrated into these cult places, into the shrines, into the Egyptian temples by the Egyptians. And the Egyptians sort of translated their understanding of these local Nubian deities and also their understanding of how to imagine, how to picture these deities, these local Nubian deities, into their Egyptian understanding. So we see something like an interpretatio Egyptiaca of local Nubian deities. And by doing so, Thutmose III and other pharaohs that built temples, what we see is a religious takeover over Nubia that happened also to legitimize Egyptian rule. So the pharaohs built temples, integrated local deities into those temples, and by this legitimized their political and religious control and the Egyptian dominance over this region. This region is Lower Nubia, or the region of Aniba, but Paolo, do we have something comparable to the Ellesiya chapel also somewhere in the south?
Well, yes. I was listening to your explanation explanation, and it's really amazing how the Egyptians were really building this religious landscape, and how they were building this religious landscape also inside the monuments they were constructing in Nubia. How important was for these monuments to be really embedded in this religious landscape. And so, unfortunately, the Temple of Elicia is now in the Turin Museum. So we have lost part of this context and religious landscape. And although we can try to reconstruct part of it using the old photographs and digital technology, but there's another chapel, actually, of Tutmosis III that can show us very well how these monuments were inserted in this religious landscape. And it is the chapel of Jebel Dosha, which is a rock-cut chapel located between the second and the third cataract. And so south of Ellesiya, as you see from the map. And yeah, in these photos, we can see also the inside is very close to the plan of the Ellesiya temple. What can you tell us about this temple?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So, as Paolo already mentioned, the Jebel Dosha chapel can really be understood as a counterpart to the Ellesiya chapel. Interestingly, from the texts that are preserved in the inscriptions at Jebel Dosha, inside the chapel and outside in secondary rock inscriptions, we know that this place was called Ju-Wab, so pure mountain, by the Egyptians. And by this we see that they understood this prominent sandstone hill, you know, that is overlooking the Nile, that they understood this as a place of high religious local significance. And maybe they also thought that deities would sort of live, you know, Numina would live in this rock, and that's why they sort of decided, or Tutmosis III and his architects and his priests decided to also use this place to cut out a counterpart chapel to Ellesiya at the Jebel Dosha. The chapel itself is very similar in plan and content and style to the Ellesiya chapel, however, less well preserved. Only fragments of the relief remain, and this rather bad state of preservation is related to an earthquake that shook this mountain, and several parts of the facade fell off, and also later engagement with the chapel in later times obliterated some of the earlier relief decorations. So, but what we already see here on the slide, that also there in the niche at the end we have 3 statues, and they can with certainty also identified as Amun-Ra on the north, the king, and Sarted in the south. So what you see here is something that we've seen in the Kasser Ibrahim chapel of the Viceroy Nechi, that we've seen at Ellesiya, so something that reappears here. And again, also this Jebel Dosha rock-cut chapel is part of this whole building program of Tutmosis III, integrating not only Lower Nubia, but in this case also Upper Nubia into the Egyptian religious topography and into understanding, and translating local Nubian religious Numina deities into an Egyptian way of understanding and display, and also providing those deities an Egyptian form of cult at this place. It seems that the Jebel Dosha chapel was a monument that was meant for the celebration of the event of inundation. So when the Nile rose and brought its fertile water, something that was very important for the ancient Egyptians. And yeah, also, as the Elicia chapel, the Jebel Dosha chapel is dedicated to the cult of the king on the one hand, and also integrates these local forms of Amun-Ra and Satet. But I do remember rightly that a few years ago, in fact, Paolo, other colleagues and me, that we were able to visit the Jebel Dosha itself and take a look at this place and take a look at the environment. Paolo, can you maybe show us some photos and go into a little bit more detail?
Yes, I must say we were extremely lucky, and it was 2014, and we were both working with the British Museum expedition at Amara West, and so we decided to do a study trip to this chapel, also to other temples in the area, but especially to see where this chapel was. And you see from the photos, it's an amazing place, and it's really overlooking the River Nile, which in that point is extremely large and wide. And there's a sand dune, a huge sand dune coming from the desert and covering part of the mountain. And then you have these amazing inscriptions on the facade of the temple, of the chapel. I must say it's very important to have the possibility to look at these temples inside their landscape, and in order to understand them better. And this is especially true when you are working with temples that have been moved and transported in different places. And we just realized that today there's another celebration or another anniversary of another temple, Nubian temple, that was moved from Nubia and reached the north of Europe, the Netherlands. And yeah, it's the 50th anniversary also of the Temple of Taffa that arrived in Leiden and is now displayed inside the main court of the National Museum of Antiquities of Leiden. And so that's a post of our colleague Lara Weiss that is talking about this event. I think with this we might look at the chart if there are questions or doubts, but it looks there are no questions.
But if there are questions, now would be the moment to ask them. If not, then I hope that we sort of rounded it quite nicely, starting with our Turin Museum, Ellesiya Chapel, going through the history of Nubian-Egyptian relationships, then focusing on the archaeological, cultopographical landscape into which the Ellesiya Chapel was once embedded in. And then we made this detour towards the south to look at the Jebel Dosha, through which we understand that the Ellesiya temple is not, it's a singular monument in its own right as a monument, but it has parallels, it has counterparts. It's part of really an Egyptian approach of ritually appropriating a foreign landscape and land. And this is something that we also see in other contexts. So how Egyptians dealt with the appropriation of foreign territory. If there are any questions, please go ahead. If not, then thank you all for tuning in, for watching, for being part of this. And
Yeah, thank you. And see you in other events.
see you in other online events in the future. Let's hope that there will be many more to come, and we have many of these formats planned for the future. But let's also hope that sooner or later a museum will be open so that we can welcome you here to the museum in Turin, that you can visit the Ellesiya temple in person by yourself and, you know, look at the chapel itself, and maybe you remember what we told you, and then you can experience the whole chapel itself, but always keep in mind that there was, you know, a Nile, there was a landscape, there was more to this monument that you see in the museum. So I see that there is a question. I like the idea of a religious landscape. Do you believe that the idea might be applied to Egypt as a whole, or that it was linked to specific areas, regions? Paolo, do you want to say something about this?
I think, yeah, probably something that was really applied to the whole of Egypt, because at least as far as what we see from the Egyptian sources, we always see this need to have a precise geography of the country and to have precise delimitations as well, and then the fact that every town, especially in the late period, for instance, if you think at the really at the number of different temples with different deities that were spread along the Nile in Egypt, it really means that it was extremely important to have this local religious landscape, but inserted into a global or Egyptian religious landscape. What do you think?
I agree. I think we have this, the religious landscape that covers the whole of Egypt, sort of said the state religious landscape, but then we have these local regional centers or landscapes that are then, for instance, formed at the first cataract with Khnum, Satet, and Anuket, and the local shrines there, including also Amun. Or we have obviously Thebes, Western Thebes and Eastern Thebes with Karnak, and all the royal memorial temples around, and also the temples of Armand and further south and to the north. So Medamud, also there, you know, we see that the Egyptian way of living in their experienced daily experience geography, so to say, really entails, you know, having cult places at specific spots. And we also know that, for instance, every Egyptian city also needed a temple for a deity. Otherwise, the city would not really function as a city, or would, in Egyptian understanding, not be a proper Egyptian town, because it's necessary for at least larger centers to have bigger temples, and the smaller, you know, the settlements get the less formal, so to say, these cultic installations and get.
Okay, we have another question apparently, which is, I would like to know if there is any influence of the climate change on the heritage and how it could be preserved.
Well, I have an answer that does not really come back to the climate change that we're seeing now, but this is that goes back to the buildings of these dams. Even this had a huge impact on the local water regime in Egypt, since the River Nile was controlled, and the seasonal flow of the Nile with the floods and the ebb was not, the Nile could not flow as it used to flow for several millennia, and thus also the building of those dams changed the underground water level. And after the big Aswan Dam was built, also many monuments to the north of it, so particularly also at Thebes and Karnak, suffered from a rising water level. So their stone foundations were soaked wet, and the stones began to crumble, and also some parts of the reliefs fell off. So it was a big also then problem in conserving and rescuing in this. So what these dams also do, that is something that we see at the dam at the fourth cataract, so next to the Jebel Barkal. After this dam was filled, those people living there experience a local change of climate and temperature, and there's more rain, and everything is a little bit topsy-turvy in terms of climate. So also these large exposures of water in an earlier region that was desert and where only a small strip of the Nile went through also left a huge impact on local climate, and this then also has implications for the future. And if the climate change that we see now on a global scale also hits this region with more force, then we will definitely also see that this will affect the cultural heritage. And one element also is the ongoing desertification of former savanna areas in northern Sudan, a little bit further to the south. So colleagues at Meroe, so Bejlawiya, they have the problem that the wind is constantly bringing lots of sand into the archaeological site. So there is lots of erosion of the ground taking place, and also the idea is to take measurements against this. So like planting trees along those corridors where the wind would go, also to not let the wind allow to, the wind is carrying sand, grains of sand, and those are like rubbing on the surface of those pyramids in Bedrawiya, and also taking off reliefs, and also disintegrate the stability of those still standing structures. So there are lots of implications of local climate change caused by local interventions like dams, but I think it has definitely larger implications, and we should all be aware and take care that we find means and ways to preserve our cultural heritage in the Nile Valley and the deserts, obviously.
Yeah, I think we are already experiencing effects of also the global climate change, because if you think, for instance, of the episodes that are extreme weather episodes like heavy rains and flash floods in the area of Luxor, for instance, they are becoming more and more frequent. And also, I actually personally experienced also the heavy rains and very, very sudden and heavy rains coming from the desert in Saqqara during the expedition we were there. And these are coupled with the opposite weather episodes. So like sandstorms, like the huge sandstorm that hit Cairo and coming from the desert, from Giza and from Saqqara, that hit completely the whole city of Cairo a few years ago, and it was incredible and really astonishing and worrying, because these episodes are becoming more and more frequent, unfortunately. And so what we can do is very little, but we can do something for the preservation of the monuments. For instance, in Saqqara, all the tombs that were excavated in the last years and that are now subject to these weather conditions, they need to be protected. And so we are all the time studying new methods to protect these architectures. They are very fragile architectures because they are made of mud bricks mainly, or very, very fragile limestone reliefs and blocks. And so we need to think, when we start every archaeological project, we have now to think immediately the ways to protect what we are going to find, because archaeology is not only destructive in its nature during the excavation, but it's also destructive in the sense that it brings to light these monuments, and then these monuments need a protection from all these problems, and from looters, of course, but more and more frequently also from climate conditions and climate change. So if there are no more questions, I think we can now really thank all the people that attended this dialogue, and give you an appointment to the future events of the Museo Egizio, or an appointment to meet you in person in the museum. Let's hope as soon as possible. Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.